The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a streak of orange fading into deep violet over the Arizona desert. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that clings to your skin long after sunset. Out past the edge of town, cicadas hummed in the mesquite trees, and the smell of dry dust carried on the warm breeze. This was the kind of night when nothing bad was supposed to happen. Her name was Lisa Montgomery, 23 years old. Born and raised in the quiet desert town of Canyon Ridge, a place where the biggest headlines were high school football scores and church bake sales. Lisa had a laugh that carried across a room. She worked as a clerk at the local hardware store during the day and took night classes at the community college, determined to earn her degree in graphic design. She loved bright colors, 80s rock ballads, and the old Polaroid camera her father had given her at 16. Her apartment was small, just a one-bedroom above the laundromat, but she filled it with plants, postcards, and half-finished art projects. To the people who knew her best, Lisa wasn't just the friendly girl at the counter or the neighbor who offered to water your plants when you were out of town. She was the glue in her circle of friends. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who baked cupcakes for no reason, who could sense when someone was having a bad day and showed up at their door with takeout. On Friday, August 17, 1990, Lisa clocked out of work at 6:03 p.m., according to the time card still kept in the store's files. She wore a faded denim jacket over her favorite sundress, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She told her co-workers she was heading home to change before meeting friends at a local diner. But somewhere between the hardware store and the diner, Lisa vanished from the path she'd walked hundreds of times before. Her mother, Carol Montgomery, would later say in interviews, Lisa was the kind of person you expected to walk in the door any second. She never stayed out of touch. If she was late, she'd call. That night, nothing. Not a word. Her younger brother, Ryan, still remembers the smell of his sister's strawberry shampoo when she hugged him goodbye earlier that week. He still remembers thinking she'd be around forever. A friend who spoke to Lisa just days before her disappearance recalled something unusual. Lisa had been anxious. She mentioned a man who had been lingering near the laundromat late at night, a stranger who seemed to watch her more than once. She brushed it off with a nervous laugh, saying she probably just imagined it. Canyon Ridge in 1990 was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes after dark and no one locked their doors unless they were going on vacation. Crime was rare, violent crime rarer still. People prided themselves on knowing everyone, or thinking they did. When Lisa walked through town, people waved. She couldn't walk into the grocery store without running into someone who wanted to talk. That's why her disappearance would cut so deep, because if something like this could happen to Lisa Montgomery, it could happen to anyone. In the months and years that followed, one image would haunt both investigators and Lisa's family. A Polaroid found on the coffee table in her apartment. Taken just a few days before she vanished. Lisa was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sunlight spilling across her face, smiling faintly at whoever was behind the camera. It was a picture full of life, and in hindsight, it felt like a goodbye. The night of August 17th should have ended with Lisa sipping coffee in a red vinyl booth, laughing at bad diner jokes with her friends. Instead, it ended in silence. By morning, her absence would set in motion one of the most baffling investigations this small Arizona town had ever seen. Somewhere out there, in the warm desert darkness, someone knew exactly what happened to Lisa Montgomery. And for the next 30 years, they would keep that secret, hidden behind a new name, a new life, and a carefully constructed lie. But the desert doesn't forget. It holds on to the truth, until someone comes looking. The desert sun was barely up when the call came in. A hiker named Doug Rayner had been out early, walking a narrow trail near the dry riverbed about 3 miles from Canyon Ridge. The air was still cool from the night, but heat shimmer was already beginning to rise off the sand. Doug would later tell police he'd been watching for rattlesnakes when he spotted something that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes caught in a tangle of mesquite and tumbleweed. But as he got closer, he saw skin, pale, unmoving. Deputy Mark Hollis was the first to arrive on scene. He parked his cruiser just off the dirt path, his boots crunching against the hard-packed earth as he approached. The desert was quiet except for the distant call of a hawk circling above. Lisa Montgomery lay on her side, partially hidden under brush. Her denim jacket was folded neatly beside her, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Her shoes were missing. There were faint bruises on her wrists. The deputy's first instinct was to check for a pulse, but the truth was clear, she had been gone for hours. The crime scene was both strange and unsettling. No drag marks in the sand. No signs of a struggle in the immediate area. Her purse was found 10 feet away, contents intact except for her wallet. A single Polaroid photo, different from the one in her apartment, was tucked into the pocket of her sundress. In it, Lisa was standing against a blank wall, unsmiling. The air smelled faintly of gasoline. Investigators would later debate whether it came from the suspect's vehicle or was simply a byproduct of the trailhead parking area. By mid-morning, word had spread. In towns like Canyon Ridge, bad news moves faster than the wind. The diner Lisa was supposed to meet her friends at the night before fell silent when a patrol car pulled up and 2 officers walked in to speak with the manager. By noon, phone lines were jammed with neighbors calling neighbors, each retelling the fragments they'd heard. Carol Montgomery was at work when 2 officers arrived at her office. She would later recall how the younger officer couldn't meet her eyes, how the older one said her daughter's name in a voice so careful, it made her knees give out. Detective Frank Delaney, a 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, took lead on the case. He was meticulous, the kind of investigator who kept every note in neat block letters. He arrived at the scene mid-morning, immediately noting how clean it appeared, almost too clean. Delaney ordered a full sweep of the area. Technicians combed the sand for footprints, tire tracks, anything. They found partial impressions from what appeared to be a pickup truck's tires about 20 yards away. The tracks led toward the highway. But no fingerprints. No clear DNA. Nothing that could tell them who had left Lisa Montgomery in the desert. That evening, the Montgomery home filled with family and friends. Ryan sat on the couch staring at the floor while neighbors brought over casseroles they knew no one would eat. Carol answered every knock at the door, hoping it might be someone with answers. It never was. Local news aired the story at 6 p.m., grainy footage of the dirt road, a blurred shot of investigators bending over the scene, and Lisa's smiling face from a high school yearbook photo. The anchor's voice was somber. Authorities are urging anyone with information to contact the sheriff's department immediately. Late that night, Detective Delaney sat in his office staring at the Polaroid found in Lisa's pocket. The blank wall behind her. The way she stood stiff, hands at her sides. It was different from the carefree images in her apartment. This one felt posed, controlled. He made a note in the file, possible pre-death photo. Verify timeline. In the hours after Lisa's body was found, the case felt both urgent and impossible. Urgent, because whoever had done this might strike again. Impossible, because the desert had given them no witnesses, no obvious clues, only a quiet, unblinking mystery baked into the sand. And in a town that believed it knew everyone, suspicion had no choice but to turn inward. The heat that Sunday morning was already pushing past 90 degrees when Detective Frank Delaney gathered his small team in the cramped briefing room at the sheriff's office. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with the sharp tang of dry erase marker as he sketched a rough map of the trailhead where Lisa's body had been found. We start with the timeline, Delaney said, tapping the map with the back of his pen. Last confirmed sighting, 6:05 p.m., Friday. Found, 7:42 a.m., Saturday. Somewhere in those 13 hours, she was taken, killed, and left in the desert. The detail from Lisa's friend about a man lingering near the laundromat quickly rose to the top of the board. Witness description: white male, late 30s, short dark hair, stocky build, seen wearing a faded baseball cap and denim work shirt. Problem was, in 1990, that description could have matched half the men in Canyon Ridge. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, showing a sketch drawn from the witness account. A few neighbors claimed they'd seen a man like that driving an older Ford pickup, light blue, with rust along the wheel wells. But no one knew his name. Next, they looked at Matt Carter, Lisa's ex-boyfriend. They had broken up 3 months earlier, but friends described the split as tense. Detectives brought him in for questioning. "I didn't even see her that week," Matt told them, leaning back in the metal chair, his arms crossed. When asked where he'd been Friday night, he said he was at a friend's barbecue in Phoenix. The alibi checked out. Multiple people confirmed he was there until after midnight. For the moment, he was ruled out. In 1990, DNA technology was in its infancy. The crime lab collected fibers from Lisa's dress, hair strands, and the Polaroid found in her pocket. But without a national database to compare to, most of it went into evidence bags that would sit in storage for decades. Fingerprint analysis turned up nothing, no usable prints on the Polaroid, her purse, or her jacket. A waitress at the diner swore she'd seen Lisa that night around 8 p.m., sitting in a booth with a man she didn't recognize. But another patron insisted Lisa never made it to the diner at all. The conflicting accounts forced detectives to consider 2 possibilities. Either Lisa left the diner with this mystery man, or she was intercepted before she could even get there. By late August, police received a tip about a drifter camping near the railroad tracks outside town. He matched the laundromat man's description and drove, supposedly, an old blue pickup. When deputies tracked him down, they found him sitting by a fire, cooking a can of beans. He was cooperative, even offered them coffee from a dented percolator. His truck turned out to be green, and he had a bus ticket showing he'd arrived in Canyon Ridge only the morning after Lisa disappeared. It was another dead end. Privately, Delaney began to wonder if the person who killed Lisa wasn't an outsider at all. The crime scene's lack of disturbance suggested someone who knew the terrain well, someone confident enough to leave her in a spot they believed wouldn't be stumbled upon. The photo found in Lisa's pocket kept bothering him. Why would the killer leave it there? Was it a trophy, a signature, or a message? Delaney sent it to the state crime lab, asking them to examine the lighting, shadows, and wall texture. The report came back inconclusive. The wall was plain, painted off-white, possibly part of an apartment or garage. The photo offered no clear location. Local reporters began circling the case, showing up at the sheriff's office demanding updates. Headlines in the Canyon Ridge Gazette read, "Small town still on edge after young woman's murder." At the same time, the Montgomery family was holding nightly vigils outside their home. Candles flickered against the desert night, Lisa's high school graduation photo resting on a folding table beside handwritten notes from friends. By the end of the first month, Delaney's board was cluttered with names, half-finished leads, and maps dotted with pushpins. The killer's identity remained a blank space in the center. And with no suspect in sight, the whispers began. In Canyon Ridge, the heat lingered well into September, pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket. But it wasn't just the weather making people restless, it was the feeling that a killer might be walking among them. People began locking their doors at night, something they hadn't done in years. Parents told their daughters not to walk home alone. And the chatter in grocery store aisles, church parking lots, and the diner booths turned from everyday gossip to theories about who had killed Lisa Montgomery. The detail about the man seen near the laundromat, the stocky stranger with a baseball cap, became the first major rumor to take root. By the time it reached the far edges of town, the description had grown. Some said he had a scar across his cheek, others swore he was seen with a hunting knife on his belt. No two versions were exactly the same. Detective Delaney knew how damaging half-truths could be, but once a story like that takes hold in a small town, it's almost impossible to pull it back. Even though Matt Carter's alibi had been solid, some in Canyon Ridge refused to believe it. People whispered about him in the hardware store, lowered their voices when he walked into the diner. Matt eventually stopped showing his face in public unless he had to. The sideways glances and murmured accusations were too much. The Montgomerys' next-door neighbor, Mrs. Hanley, told reporters she had a feeling about someone who lived just 2 streets over, a quiet man who kept to himself. When asked for evidence, she admitted she didn't have any, just a gut instinct. Still, the story spread, and soon that man's name was being whispered in line at the post office. Businesses began closing earlier. Attendance at the Friday night football games dropped. Even the town's annual chili cook-off, normally a big draw, had fewer contestants and an undercurrent of tension. At night, the streets that were once lit only by the soft glow of porch lights now had patrol cars slowly cruising, scanning for anything out of place. 2 weeks after Lisa's funeral, her mother agreed to speak at a community gathering at the local church. The fellowship hall was packed, folding chairs filled, people standing along the walls. Carol's voice trembled as she thanked everyone for their support, but when she spoke about the rumors, her tone sharpened. "We can't let fear turn us against each other. Someone out there knows the truth. If you know something, anything, go to the police. Don't just whisper about it." Her words quieted the room, but outside, the speculation didn't stop. If the person responsible for Lisa's death was still in Canyon Ridge, they would have seen the chaos their crime had created. And in that chaos, they had cover. The town's focus was scattered, suspicion jumping from one name to the next, making it harder for detectives to zero in on the right one. By October, Delaney had begun holding closed-door meetings to keep certain details out of the public eye. He feared that too much chatter would contaminate witness statements or push the killer further into hiding. Still, every time he stepped into a coffee shop or filled his gas tank, someone would lean in and say, "I heard it was so-and-so," usually followed by a story that had grown far from the original facts. Canyon Ridge was a place where everyone thought they knew everyone else. But Lisa Montgomery's murder had cracked that illusion wide open. Now, every friendly wave, every passing smile carried a shadow of doubt. And for the first time in decades, the town began to wonder if the danger was right next door. Empty streets. Lisa Montgomery's case file now sat in the middle drawer of Detective Delaney's desk, still active, but with fewer new pages being added. Leads had thinned to nothing. The man from the laundromat had never been found. The Polaroid remained unexplained. And the tire tracks near the crime scene were too common to match to a single vehicle. Every August, on the anniversary of Lisa's death, her family held a candlelight vigil at the trailhead. Some years, dozens of people came. Other years, just a handful. Ryan, her younger brother, always stood in the same spot, near the mesquite brush where she was found. In local news interviews, Carol Montgomery's message never changed. We just want answers. If someone knows something, please, say it before it's too late. Over the next decade, Lisa's file passed through the hands of 3 different detectives. Each brought fresh energy, rereading every page, making calls, trying new angles. And each came to the same frustrating end: no suspect they could prove, no evidence they could use in court. One younger detective, fresh out of the academy in 1998, suggested sending the fibers and hair from the crime scene to the state lab for DNA testing. But at the time, the lab's backlog was months long, and with no suspect to compare the sample to, it was just another entry in the pending column. Ryan graduated college in 2000. Lisa wasn't there to see it. Carol turned 60 in 2002. The birthday cake had one candle lit for Lisa, a tradition that felt less comforting and more heartbreaking with each passing year. In a box in her bedroom closet, Carol kept every news clipping, every flyer, every note from strangers offering prayers. But she also kept the Polaroid from Lisa's pocket, sealed in an envelope, away from light, away from dust. She couldn't look at it often. By the mid-2000s, Canyon Ridge had changed. A new supermarket went up on the edge of town. The diner where Lisa was supposed to meet her friends closed and became a tax prep office. New families moved in, many unaware of the murder that had once shaken the town to its core. But for those who remembered, the case was never truly in the past. For them, every unfamiliar face, every unmarked pickup truck on the highway carried the faint possibility of connection to Lisa's death. In 2007, Frank Delaney retired. On his last day, he stopped by the evidence room and placed his hand on the box labeled Montgomery, L. the 17th of August 90. Someone will solve this one day, he said quietly to the evidence clerk. In 2010, a tip came in from across state lines. A man in Nevada who fit the laundromat description had been arrested on unrelated charges. Detectives pulled his file, sent off a request for fingerprints and DNA comparison. 2 weeks later, the results came back, no match. The hope that had flickered briefly was gone again. By the late 2010s, DNA testing had evolved. Even partial samples could be analyzed with far greater accuracy. Some cold cases were being solved across the country thanks to genetic genealogy, investigators building family trees from distant relatives in public databases. Lisa's evidence was still in storage, carefully preserved. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to pull it out again. And in 2019, nearly 3 decades after Lisa's murder, that's exactly what happened. A young detective, reviewing old files on a slow afternoon, would spot something in Lisa's case that others had missed, a single overlooked detail that would shatter the silence around her death. The desert had kept its secret long enough. The case had sat in the evidence room for decades, buried under dust and the weight of unanswered questions. Detectives had stared at the same files, the same crime scene photos, the same faded witness statements, and gotten nowhere. But in late 2023, everything changed. It started with a statewide initiative to re-examine unsolved homicides from the 1980s and 90s using modern technology. Cold case detectives in Phoenix began pulling boxes from storage, one by one, logging each piece of evidence into the new system. When they reached the Arizona 1990 case, they didn't expect much. Among the carefully labeled bags and envelopes was a tiny scrap of fabric, overlooked in earlier investigations. Back in 1990, DNA analysis was in its infancy. All they could do was note its presence. But now, the technology could read genetic information from a single microscopic cell. The evidence was rushed to the state crime lab. 4 weeks, the detectives waited, knowing they might be chasing another dead end. Then, in mid-January 2024, the email came in. Possible hit, national database match. The name that came back wasn't some stranger. It was someone local. Someone who had been interviewed in the original investigation, and cleared. A man who'd lived just a few miles from the crime scene in 1990, who had blended into the neighborhood as if he belonged. Detectives' pulses quickened. They pulled his old statement from the archive. The words read differently now, defensive in places where they once seemed casual. And more troubling, several details in his account didn't match the verified timeline of events. The next move was clear. They began quiet surveillance. Days of watching became weeks. The man's routines were ordinary, trips to the store, early morning walks, but detectives weren't looking for behavior. They were waiting for a chance to grab a fresh DNA sample. It came one night when he left a coffee cup on a public park bench. A plainclothes officer swooped in seconds after he walked away, slipping it into an evidence bag. When the lab results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA from that decades-old scrap of fabric matched the man's saliva. 34 years after the crime, detectives finally had their breakthrough, and a name. The arrest would come soon, but for now, the team sat in their cramped office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above them. One detective leaned back in his chair, exhaling hard. 30 years, he said quietly. And has been right here the whole time. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting, streaking the sky in blood-orange light. For the first time in decades, the case file on the desk felt lighter, no longer a box of unsolved questions, but the beginning of long-awaited justice. Argued he was a flight risk and a danger to the community. She read from the original case file. Melissa last seen walking home from a convenience store. Witnesses recalling a man in a dark sedan. Fibers on her clothing matching carpet found in Hughes' old car. When she mentioned the new DNA evidence, the judge didn't hesitate. Bail is denied. Hughes would wait for trial in a cell. That night, Melissa's mother spoke publicly for the first time in years. Standing outside her modest home, her voice trembled but didn't break. It's been 32 years since I last saw my daughter smile. I prayed for this day, but I didn't know if I'd live to see it. Now, maybe we can finally bring her home the right way. She clutched a framed photo of Melissa, the same one from her high school graduation. A photo that had sat on her mantle through every season, every holiday, every year that passed without answers. This was no longer a cold case. It was a case on fire. And the trial, the part where the truth would finally be tested, was coming fast. 33 years had passed since that night in 1990, but the weight of it still hung heavy in the air. Rows of folding chairs creaked as neighbors, reporters, and family members leaned forward, eyes fixed on the man in the defense seat. The suspect, now in his late 50s, looked smaller than anyone remembered. Time had shrunk him, but the accusations made him loom like a shadow over every heart in that room. The prosecution's opening statement was a gut punch. They laid it out in slow, deliberate beats: the victim's final hours, the overlooked evidence, and the DNA match that shattered 3 decades of doubt. The jurors didn't look away. Then came the witnesses. The retired detective, his voice gravelly with age, relived the frustration of chasing dead ends. A forensic expert explained how new technology pulled a genetic fingerprint from a scrap of evidence once considered useless. A family member, clutching a photo of the victim, broke down mid-sentence. The defense countered hard, questioning the chain of custody, poking at the reliability of memories after so many years. They painted the DNA as circumstantial, suggesting contamination or lab error. But with each rebuttal, the prosecution tightened the net. Midway through the trial, a surprise came. The victim's old friend, who had stayed silent for decades, finally took the stand. She revealed something she had never told police, an argument she overheard between the victim and the accused days before the murder. The defense tried to shake her, but her voice held steady. By closing arguments, the tension was electric. The prosecutor's final words echoed in the silence. 33 years is a long time to wait for justice. But justice delayed is not justice denied. The jury filed out. An hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. Every creak of the door made the room jump. Finally, they returned. The foreman rose, unfolding the verdict form with trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The words landed like thunder. Gasps. Cries. The victim's family clung to each other, tears streaming. The accused stared ahead, jaw clenched, eyes unblinking. Outside, the courthouse steps became a flood of emotion. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and a family finally able to say the word they'd been chasing for decades: justice. The gavel's final strike echoed in the courtroom, but outside, Arizona's late summer sun blazed like nothing had changed. For the victim's family, though, everything had shifted. Decades of waiting, endless nights of imagining what might have happened, years of false leads and dead ends, finally, they had an answer. Not the one they wanted, but the one they needed. The victim's mother, now in her 70s, gripped a faded photograph of her daughter. She had carried it to every hearing, every press conference, every prayer vigil. Today, she held it like a shield and a lifeline. "Justice doesn't bring her back," she told reporters, her voice trembling, "but it lets me breathe again." The lead detective, now long retired, stood in the back of the room. He'd carried the case file through 3 decades of transfers and budget cuts, refusing to let it gather dust. As the verdict was read, he lowered his head, not in defeat, but in relief. This was the moment cold case investigators live for, the day persistence outlasts silence. In the weeks that followed, the small Arizona town began to heal. A mural went up downtown, painted by local artists, honoring the victim. Community members left flowers at its base, not just for her, but for every life lost without answers. The case became a rallying cry for the importance of preserving evidence, for never giving up on the forgotten. It was discussed in law enforcement conferences, inspiring younger officers to see the long game of justice. But justice, here, was complicated. Some saw it as closure. Others as a wound ripped open again. The convicted man's family claimed he was innocent, filing appeals and holding protests outside the courthouse. For the victim's family, it was another reminder that in real life, there are no clean endings, only choices about how to carry the truth forward. The detective's words at the press conference captured it best. Justice in a cold case isn't about revenge. It's about dignity. We gave her back her name. We made sure she wasn't just a file number in a box. And so, 3 decades after the desert wind swallowed the victim's last breath, her story found its way into court records, news headlines, and the hearts of a community determined to remember her. Her name would not fade. Her story would not be buried. And for those who had carried the weight of her absence all these years, justice, however imperfect, had finally arrived. Washington, 1975. The ink on the Arizona verdict was barely dry when another file slid across the cold metal desk in the detective's office. The folder was old, the kind of yellowed paper and brittle corners that screamed decades of dust and neglect. Inside, photographs. Grainy, black and white shots of a wooded clearing outside Spokane. A woman's body, partially covered by autumn leaves. The date stamp in the corner read October 12, 1975. 4 years, the case had gone cold. Witnesses died. Leads faded. The evidence locker was thought to be empty. Until last week. A janitor, cleaning out a sealed basement storage room in the county courthouse, stumbled on a cardboard box marked only with a number, #7462WA. Inside was a single glass vial, wrapped in wax paper. The label, blood evidence, do not discard. And in that moment, investigators realized they were holding the one thing they had never been able to get before, a preserved sample that could finally yield DNA. The lab's first run had just come back. And it matched someone in the national database. The same name appeared in connection to another unsolved murder, in Oregon, 1982. Suddenly, what looked like an isolated, decades-old killing in rural Washington was shaping up to be the first in a possible multi-state serial case, one that had been hiding in plain sight for half a century. The question was no longer who, but how many. And the hunt was about to begin again.